Hello, welcome to this lesson for CPI 111. Now we've reached the time of the semester where you have learned pretty much all of the main things that you need to be able to do to create games in GameMaker. So we're going to geek out a little and learn some fun and quite advanced things that you can use if you wish to make your games even better. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to auto-generate levels for an RPG game. Let me show you where we're headed. Here's our little guy from our RPG lessons that we've been having in class. Cruising along. And you'll note if you are coming into this lesson straight from working on the RPG lessons that this has some familiarity with what we did in the RPG lesson. We got our trees and our bushes, we have the floor, we have the same character, and so on. But I can reset this, and each time I reset it, we create a new version of the level that is automatically generated using tiles. I auto-generate a random number of enemies and randomly place them around in the room. Hi there, fellas. The version I'm using for this lesson, the finished version, is one in which the enemies have two different attack states, the one we did in our earlier lesson and another one where they fire arrows. But other than that, it's essentially the same. So let me show you how we can get to that spot. So what I've got open here is the version of the RPG game that we worked on in class. It's not a full game. There's lots that's missing. For example, the player can't die, there's only one room, and so on. But it's got all of the basic functionality, including multiple states for the player and for the enemies. So for this lesson, what you will need to do is to have your version of the RPG game that we created for class. We're going to start from that. If you're starting from scratch, this lesson really won't work. This is only going to work for you if you are already done or mostly done with your RPG game. So I've got the finished version here. And what you will want to do is to open up your finished version of the RPG game and then do a save project as. This is very important so that you don't overwrite your RPG game that you may still be working on for your assignment for class. So I'm going to call this one auto level generation. You can call it whatever you want, just make sure that you do a save as so that now your RPG game is safe. You're not gonna overwrite any of the work that you've done there, and that's particularly important because we're gonna get rid of a bunch of stuff that is in that RPG game, at least stuff that is in the room. So I'm gonna open up my room now that I've done a save as, and I'm now in a new level. And here is the RPG game with all the stuff that we've got in there. And we want to start getting rid of some of this stuff in preparation. First of all, I'm going to go to the enemy layer, and on that enemy layer I've got a collection of the skeletons that we created for class, and I'm going to delete all those so we no longer have any enemies out in our room. I'm going to go to the walls layer, and I'm going to delete all those walls. I want to keep the layer itself, but I'm going to get rid of the walls. We're going to auto-generate those walls. I'm going to go to the wall tiles layer, and on the wall tiles layer, I'm going to set the tile set for that layer to none. We're going to have this odd thing here. In fact, you see when I do that, it's giving us some weird issues. So I'm going to take this one further, and I'm going to delete the wall tiles layer, and I'm going to delete the path tiles layer, which is also in your RPG game. To make sure it's unlocked so I can delete it. I'm going to delete that out of there. And then I'm going to recreate a tile layer and rename it wall tiles, like so. I'm going to take this down and position it just above the background down here so it gets drawn appropriately. Oh, what else do I want to do? I've got a pickups layer here with the strawberries on it. I'm going to get rid of all of those, but keep the layer. And I've got the greenery layer with all the grass and the trees. And I'm going to get rid of all those. Okay, so in the end, the only thing we're going to have left out in our room is the player. We have a controller object here. I think it's on the player layer. A controller object and the camera object left over from our RPG game. That's it. Now I'm not even sure if we run this if it'll still work. It should work, I think. It may get confused because we no longer have any enemies. Let's take a look. Nope, still okay. So we just have our player cruising around this empty room with no enemies, no walls, no background, no pickups, no greenery, no nothing. We're going to generate all of that through code. So once you've got that done, save to that point, and then let's get to work on creating a script that we can use in order to generate all this stuff that we want to show up in the room. As I get started, it is important for you to know that what we're going to be doing is a much modified version of a set of lessons by Benjamin Anderson, Heartbeast, my favorite YouTube game maker tutorial guy. He has a pair of videos on random level generation. Some of the, or I guess I should say, a lot of the code in our script that we're going to use to generate the stuff in our room comes from this set of lessons. But man, we are changing a ton as well. So once you've got our lesson done, I encourage you to go take a look at his lessons. It will have you start from scratch to create just the player and the floor and the walls part. It doesn't have any of the other RPG elements that we're going to use. But he gives a nice explanation of some of this stuff. He actually has a couple different versions of it. The code we're going to be using for our main level generation script is coming from this one, this GameMaker 2 tutorial, but he has an older one that he built, here it is right here, for GameMaker 1, and it's this extensive 7-part series on level generation. The code is a little out of date now because it was based on an older version of GameMaker. But if you really get into this and you want to know more about level generation, his older set of lessons goes in a lot of detail around data structures in GameMaker, which is what we're going to use in this lesson. And it also has some discussion of binary number systems and bit mapping and a whole bunch of other things that I will talk about in this lesson, but I'm not going to go into extensive explanation. So if you really want to geek out, go back and look through his older set of lessons from a few years ago, in which he goes in great depths to talk about some powerful but complicated areas of functionality in GameMaker. All right, so back to ours. We're going to have a single object that is going to do most of the work here. So I'm going to create a new object, and I'm going to call it O level. It's going to be a kind of a controller object, so it doesn't need to have a sprite. It's going to have a create event, and the create event is where all the action is going to occur. So hold on to your hat here and stick with me as I go through a kind of an extensive bit of coding, and I'll try to describe what's happening. And if you don't understand what's going on right away, everything is all within this single script. So work your way through it. If there's parts you don't understand, sort of take a break and study until you sort of figure out what's going on. There's one aspect, at least, of this script that is so complicated that I'm not even going to explain it. But I will refer you to other lessons that you can look at online to get an understanding of one particular complicated piece of this. All right, so this is going to be our generate level stuff script. All right. Let me explain a little bit about what it is we're going to do. In class, in our prior lessons, particularly starting with our RPG game, we began to use two-dimensional arrays. And in our two-dimensional arrays, we were storing values associated with specific sprites that we wanted to display in the room for our player and for our enemy. And the idea of a 2D array was pretty straightforward. You can think of it as a kind of a checkerboard in which each slot on the checkerboard is a space inside an array where you can store a variable. In this lesson and in this script, we're going to start making use of a data structure in GameMaker. And a data structure is, well, there are different kinds, but we're going to create a particular type of data structure called a grid. And a grid data structure is just basically a different way of doing a 2D array. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Here too, I'm not going to go into super detail. I just want to show you that these things exist, and we'll talk a bit about how they operate. And then if you really want to get in deep into understanding all the different types of data structures that are available to you in GameMaker, you can go into the documentation itself, or in the older version of Heartbeast's lesson on level generation, he goes into a lot of detail around data structures as well. Okay, so first thing we're going to do, and the general idea of what we're going to do for this script that's going to be kind of long, is the following. We are going to define a grid data structure. So think of it as a 2D array. And in that grid data structure, if you imagine this kind of checkerboard pattern, what we're going to do in this script is define a little controller, purely script-based, that is going to sit initially in the center of a 2D checkerboard sort of grid that we create. And this little controller is going to start moving through that 2D checkerboard grid at random, essentially. And as it moves through the 2D grid, it's going to make choices about whether a particular spot in this invisible checkerboard is going to be a floor tile or a wall tile or nothing. Okay? As it moves through the grid, it's going to start in the center and sort of work its way outward. What it effectively is going to be doing is describing the layout for a room. Okay? So in our RPG game, we did that ourselves. We just used the auto tiling and we sort of drew out the stuff that we wanted out inside the room. And so by setting up a checkerboard via this grid data structure and then having a little controller meander through that grid and then make its own choices about what is going to be in each spot, we can automatically generate the layout of a room. Then, once we do that, we will associate the information that that little controller that's walking through our checkerboard is recording with specific versions of tiles, either a floor or a wall. Once we've done that, then we can generate the room itself, and as we're generating the actual room, we will randomly place enemies and trees and bushes and grass and pickups out into the room as it's being generating, making sure that where we're placing those objects is not inside a wall, that it's where we have a floor. So that's the overall big picture of what we're going to do. Okay. All right. To make this script work that we're creating, or to make this set of actions work inside this create event for our level object, I actually need to do one other thing first. And this is going to introduce a new concept to you that we've not done yet in class, and that is we are going to create some macros. What in the world does that mean? Well, I'll explain. I'm going to create a new script, and let's name it. Call it create macros. So you can see this here, create macros. And inside this create macros script, we're going to create macros. What does that mean? Well, let me create one and then I'll explain it. We use this keyword, I guess, just like we did when we created regions inside our code. Remember that? We had a start region and an end region using the little hashtag. That's what we're doing here too. So we're going to say macro, and then we're going to create a macro that we're going to call cell underscore width. I'm making this all in capital letters so that when I go to use this phrase or this word inside my other code, I will know immediately this is a special kind of thing. It's not a regular variable. It's going to be a macro instead. And then I'm going to put 32. All right, boy, this is extra confusing. So this looks unlike anything we've done before. So what exactly is a macro? All we're doing here is that it's kind of like a variable, except that for one thing, it's constant, just like when we created an enumeration and we put values in the enumeration and I said you can't change those values. Once you set them, they're set. With a macro, what we're doing is we are saying inside my code, I'm going to use this term, cell width. And when GameMaker goes to compile my code and publish out the game to run, it's going to walk through all my code, and everywhere where it sees this term, cell width, it's going to replace it with this number, 32. Functionally, all we're doing is just making things easier for us to read by replacing just a number with this word, so we can use this word. Practically, something you need to notice is that we're not using an equal sign here. We're just saying cell width 32. Okay, so it's got a totally different kind of syntax from what we've done previously when we were setting up variables. So just make note of this, because if you try to put an equal sign in there, you're going to run into trouble. And if you're a little confused about what that means, remember that you can right-click and you can get information about what macros are exactly. But really, the main idea is just this, that all we're doing is we're just setting up a phrase that will be replaced by a number when the project is compiled into executable code. Okay? And this is something that can't change ever. Once you've written it, it's you can't update it later on by saying cell width equals 64. That won't work. Okay. All right, I'm going to copy this, paste it in, and then we're going to have another one called cell height, also 32. Then we're going to have a few that are we're going to make use of as we move through the checkerboard grid to decide floors, walls, and so on. We're going to have a few macros for those too. So I'm going to say macro, and I have one called floor, and I'm going to have that be -5. So what does this number mean? The number for the floor, and another one we're going to do in a second is a wall, another one we're going to do in a second is void. The actual numbers don't really mean a whole lot. We just need to have unique numbers for these things. Okay, so just stick with me. And I'm giving them negative numbers, and I'm starting with -5 because they're in GameMaker. -4 has a specific value, which is no one. Remember when we set up our RPG game, we initialize the state of the parent enemy to no one? What GameMaker did with that is to replace no one with the -4. Okay. All right, so we're gonna have another one here. I'm gonna copy and paste this one. We're gonna have one here called wall, and we'll have wall be -6. We're gonna have another one here called void, and void will be -7. And we're going to have a few more. When we go to position floor objects or wall objects, we're going to make use of something that I'm not going to explain deeply, which is bit masking. I will explain a little when we get to that point, but to make use of that, we're going to define a few other macros as well. And even though here this floor, wall, and void, these numbers themselves, by themselves, don't have particular meaning, for bit masking, we need to have some specific numbers. So make sure that you use the same numbers for this next piece. All right, so we're going to have a macro for north, and that value is going to be 1. Copy that. Paste, paste, paste. We're going to have one for west. That is going to be 2. We're going to have one for east. That's going to be 4. We're going to have one for south. And that is going to be 8. So make sure this is in the same order: north, west, east, south, and use these values: 1, 2, 4, and 8. This is going to be important when we get to the bit masking part. Alright, so we've created this script, and up until this moment in class, every time we've created a script, if we wanted to use it, we had to call it from some other script or from some other action. So as I said, we're now in the nerding out section of our course. So I'm going to tell you that with this macros script, once we have defined these, we don't have to call this script. As we work here in our O level object in the create event, the things that I just set up in that macro script, it will work without having to call it. Okay. So here we are back in this create script. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to put in the word, back to lowercase, not enough coffee yet this morning. Randomize. Randomize just means one of the things we want to do in this level generation little project is we're going to set up a key on our keyboard to allow us to restart the room just by pressing a key, which will then recreate the level in the game. And if we want to have that level randomly generated and be different every time we restart the room, we need to use this, randomize. That's what this does. Okay. All right, then we're going to be working with the tile layer that's out in our room. So when we started this project, I had to get rid of the tile layers that you had already, and then I had to create a new tile layer called wall tiles. And we need to have a reference to this layer because we're going to position tiles out in the room onto this layer. So to get a reference to that, I'm going to set up a local variable. So first of all, I'm going to say get reference to the tile layer. We're going to set a local variable called I'll call it var wall map ID equals, and we're going to use a built-in function called layer tile map, and then you see there are a collection of built-in ones: create, destroy, exist, and get ID. And we want get ID, and then we pass the name of the tile map layer that we created in our room, and that will get us the ID to that one, so then we can talk to it from here in the script. Then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create and set up a grid data structure. So this is a different form of setting up a 2D array. We're going to have a instance variable is called width. And I'm using the naming scheme that Benjamin Anderson uses. I've talked about this in class before, where for local variables, he likes to put an underscore at the beginning of the name of the variable. For instance variables, he likes to put an underscore at the end of the name of the variable. I haven't been doing this in class very consistently because I find it confusing for the instance variables. It's too easy to forget to put this on there. But because I want you to be able to, if you wish, once our class is done, if you're continuing with GameMaker, you can go back and look at his video, and without having to change too many things, you should be able to use his stuff. So I'm going to follow his naming scheme for this project. So I'm going to say set up an instance variable with our custom version of width, and I'm going to set it to room width divided by cell, and here we go. Here's our macros. Cell width. All right, so what am I doing here exactly, and why am I using this div rather than saying divided? What the heck is going on with that? Well, here we are in the help file for GameMaker's GML. And you can see by using div, what I'm going to get is the integer of the division without any remainder, basically. Right? That's just another way of doing division. Okay. And what we're doing with this is we're setting it up so that we set our cell width, in our case, to 32. Okay, remember when we created the macro. And so we're going to take whatever the width of the room is, and we're going to divide that by 32, and that is going to give us this width value. And what the width value is going to be is I guess the size of each cell inside this imaginary checkerboard that we're going to create. And what this allows you to do, by the way, this room width is a built-in property of the room. What this will allow you to do is to create rooms of differing dimensions and have them still work. And I'll show you this when we get into it. Okay. So I'm going to copy that and paste it, and we're going to create another one called height. And that's going to be the room height divided by the cell height. Okay. Then I'm going to create an instance variable called grid with that underscore at the end, and what this is going to hold is a reference to a grid data structure. So let's finally start to talk about what that means. I'm going to use a built-in function here called ds underscore grid underscore create. And to create a grid data structure, I need to just say what the width and the height of it are. Width, or rather I should say what each cell is. Height. So let's go to help for just a second to take a look at this. So what is a grid? Width of the grid, the height of the grid. This specifies the cell width and the cell height. Okay, so this is going to create a grid that's 10 cells high, 10 cells wide. So I guess I should say, when I'm setting up the width and the height, this is not giving me the width and height of a single cell in our grid. This is giving me the number of cells wide my checkerboard is going to be, and the number of cells up and down that my checkerboard is going to be. So it's giving me the dimensions of the checkerboard. And what we're using for the dimensions of our checkerboard is the width of the room divided by 32, the height of the room divided by 32. Okay? So how many 32 pixel cells do we want? Well, it depends on how big our room is, right? Okay. So that's what we're getting here. All right, and then the grid itself, it's worth repeating, is basically a 2D array. So we're going to start messing with this 2D array. And the first thing we're going to do is we are going to fill this grid, each cell in the grid, with some value. So let's do that. ds underscore grid underscore, we're going to use something called set region. ds grid set region. And what this is going to do is I can choose the entire grid, or I could select some subset of that grid. Again, just keep thinking of the checkerboard. Let's say I wanted to fill the entire checkerboard with 0. I could do that using this ds set grid or set region function. But maybe I only want to fill up the cells that are sort of in the middle of the checkerboard. I could do that as well. Okay? In our case, we're going to fill up the entire grid, every cell, with some value. So I first need to say which grid do I want to work with, and I want to work with the grid we just created. And where am I going to, let me show you the little helpers here at the bottom. Where am I going to start inside the grid? Well, I'm going to start at the upper left-hand corner of that checkerboard, which is 0, 0. And then where am I going to go to inside the grid? So I'm defining a square or a rectangular section within the grid that I want to fill in with some values. And well, in my case, I want to fill the whole thing. So I'm going to say width, height, and then finally, what value do I want to put in each cell that I've just said I want to cover? I'm going to put in void. That's from our macro, right? Remember that? So this is essentially saying we're filling the grid with nothing. We're initializing it with nothing. Okay. Even though this void has a number associated with it, which I don't remember at the moment, it doesn't matter. Good, so now we've set up our checkerboard, initialized it, we've got a height and a width, and we've filled up every cell in it with void. Sweet. Now remember, what I said we're going to do is we're going to have this big checkerboard, and then we're going to create a controller that's sort of, you can think of it like a little robot. And the little robot is going to start in the middle of that checkerboard and is going to randomly sort of wander through the checkerboard, deciding whether each spot in the checkerboard should be a floor or a wall. Okay, that's what we're going to do next. So let's create that controller. Or you can think of it like a robot. let's have a local variable here called controller underscore x. And we're going to say that is going to be the width of our grid divided by 2. Let's copy that, paste it in, and the y of it is going to be the height of our checkerboard divided by 2. So you understand what's happening here is we need to position our little robot out in the center of this checkerboard. And so by taking the width and height of that checkerboard, dividing it by 2, that's giving us the middle slot inside the checkerboard. Okay? Good. Then we're going to have another local variable that we're going to call controller underscore direction. Well, what we want to have happen is we want our little robot to wander across up, down, left, right, the checkerboard in random directions from the center, deciding what to position in each of those spots. Okay? So how are we going to make that happen? How are we going to choose a random direction? Well, this is going to hook you back into our RPG game, where you may remember we had a custom function called getDirectionFacing, and then we passed that like an angle between 0 and 365, and we converted those angles into a 0 for right, a 1 for up, a 2 for left, and a 3 for down. Let's make use of that same concept, that 0, 1, 2, and 3, to represent the different cardinal directions. And so we're going to say iRandom 3. Ooh, I can type right. There we go. So this is going to store in this control direction either a 0, 1, 2, or 3, and we'll use that to represent which direction we want the robot to move through the checkerboard. Okay. Then we'll have another local variable that we're going to call steps, and I'm going to set mine initially to 600. This is going to be how many steps do we want our robot to take when it is making moves through the checkerboard. How many steps should the robot take? The bigger this number, the more floor tiles you'll have. Let me put that in here too. Larger number equals more floor tiles. And I'll show you this when we do it. So if I put a real small number and then generate a level, you're going to end up with a lot of sort of long hallways with walls surrounding them. And if you make the number bigger, you're going to end up with something closer to a big open field. Okay? And you can play around with it on your own to see what's the sweet spot in terms of the kind of level you want to generate. Okay. Now let's position. Oh, let's see. What are we going to do? Sorry, I'm working off code in the background. All right, let's create another local variable that I'm going to call direction change odds. I'm going to set it to 1. What this is going to do is determine the likelihood that our little robot is going to change directions as it's walking along. Okay. So if I put this number to like 0, then it would never change. It would start in one direction and just march in that direction, which is not what we want. If we put it at 1, it means every single time it moves, it potentially might change directions. Okay, so we're setting it for 1 for now. So it's highly likely, or I guess it's not even likely, it will happen that it's going to choose a new direction. Now, it may get the same direction again, but it's always going to choose. Every step it's going to choose. All right. That's all set up for our little robot. Now, let us walk through. Let's have our little controller guy, our little robot, walk through the checkerboard and make its decisions on whether or not it's going to be a floor or a wall.